Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar here with the NCMA chapter. Our topic is Price, Realism and Reasonableness. Catherine Lambert was supposed to join us as a panelist, but unfortunately we were experiencing some technical difficulties getting her into the program. If you've got any questions specifically for her, or about the chapter, contact Catherine directly. If you've got questions today, there is a Q&A panel in your Teams window. Be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A panel. I've seen some of you in there already this morning. If you're having any audio or technical problems, you can drop those in there as well. We'll do our best to try to get you connected. If at some point you do get connected today, you should be able to simply click the link again and come right back into the webinar. And the webinar will be recorded. We will work with Catherine and the chapter to make that recording available to you in the near future. Again, my name is Robert Jones. My firm is Left Brain Professionals. We're glad again that you are here with us today. Quick introduction a quick introduction of me and about the firm. I describe our firm as being a boutique accounting firm in that we work only with government contractors. We practice primarily accounting system design, implementation, and audit support. So you can see that our background and experience there ties well with our topic today of price, reasonableness, and realism. Other tasks and projects that we get involved with our clients, a lot of work with the SF 1408 and helping our clients achieve an adequate or an approved accounting system, supporting various DCAA, DCMA audits, do a lot of work with indirect rates and strategic pricing, as well as some cybersecurity compliance and training, just like the event that you're experiencing here today. For those of you that may not know the rest of our professional team, Melissa Metzger and Stephen Bressler that you see on the screen there. Melissa was supposed to join me this morning, but she's unable to do that. If you see us at a conference or you see us online, be sure to say hi to anybody on the team here. All right, let's get into the meat of today's topic. We've got several learning objectives and a lot of information to cover. Our first learning objective at the end of today's presentation, you should be able to describe the difference between realism and reasonableness, to define price reasonableness, explain price realism, and you'll notice that I've got bold there on the price, because in a moment we're also going to talk about defining cost reasonableness and explaining cost realism. And I want to pause for a moment here and talk about these terms price and cost. Quite often they get used interchangeably. They seem to mean the same thing to some people, although they definitely do have very different meanings and applications. And the use of those terms can be confusing if they're used in the wrong context. The price is something that I pay, right? So if I go to the grocery store, I buy a package of cookies and they're $2.99. That's the price, right, of that item. That's what I'm paying for those items. The cost of those cookies to the reseller, to the retailer down the street, is different, right? So if they're charging me $2.99, it's probable that they're buying that package of cookies for $2.50 or something else, right? So the cost of that item is $2.50. The price of the item is $2.99. And I think conceptually, most of us get that and we understand that. We just have to make sure that we're using the right terms at the right times and for the right parties in the transaction. Because again, as a seller, I have the price, right, that I'm charging you. If I'm the seller and you're the consumer or my buyer, right, then I'm charging you a price. I have a different cost, but arguably the price that you paid me, if you're going to take this item and incorporate it into something else, the price that you paid me is now your cost, right, for that item. So that's where I think a lot of times we get these terms price and cost a little bit confused. And again, just be sure that you know what you're talking about. We'll get into some more of those details today because it is very important in the world of government contracting, especially when we talk about reasonableness, realism, and the analysis of both price and cost. Let's chat for a moment about realism and reasonableness. I've got a couple of definitions here from dictionary.com. Reasonable means to be agreeable to reason or sound judgment or logic. Makes sense, right? If we're talking about is somebody a reasonable person, are they utilizing sound judgment? Are they logical in what they're doing? And not exceeding the limit prescribed by reason, not excessive. And that one's going to be important in a moment. So keep that particular definition in mind. Reasonable is not exceeding the limit prescribed by reason, and it's not excessive. Realistic, on the other hand, is being interested in, concerned with, or based on what is real or practical. Okay? It also means resembling or simulating real life. And again, that second definition, I think is going to be key as we go through today's presentation. Resembling or simulating real life. So generally speaking, what I say is that reasonableness evaluates if the dollar amount is too high, right? If you and I are, let's say I'm selling my car to you and you come over and look at it, you're trying to determine if it's a reasonable price, right? Am I charging you too much for that car? So let's say that I've got well, in fact, I do have a 2014 Volvo S60 sitting in the garage right behind me. I might say I want to sell that to you for $20,000, and you say, that's not a reasonable price. The car is 7 years old, right? I can go buy a new one for not much more than that. So why would I buy, a car that's 7 years old from you that's got 100,000 miles on it for $20,000? That's not a reasonable price. And realism evaluates if the dollar amount is too low, right? So what if I told you, hey, I'll sell you that car for $500, and you'd be standing back going, what's wrong with the car, right? Why are you selling me a car for only $500? Yes, it's 7 years old and got 100,000 miles, but looks good, runs good. Like, why are you only selling it for $500? What's wrong with it, right, that you're not telling me about, right? Are the tires going to fall off when I drive around the block? What's happening here? So hopefully that helps frame the rest of today's presentation. Again, just a quick reminder, reasonableness, and these are my terms. This is not out of the FAR or anywhere else. This is my approach to say that reasonableness is I'm trying to determine is the dollar amount too high, and realism I'm trying to figure out is the dollar amount too low. All right, we do have a polling question here. There is no poll functionality, unfortunately, within Teams, but we do like to ask a few questions along the way. You can drop your answers into the Q&A if you like, just to let us know that you are seeing them, and if you have any questions. So our first polling question here is resembling or simulating real life is what? Was that being reasonable? Was that being realistic? Was that being when I said we were generally speaking, or is that none of the above? So just take a moment. Let's see how well everybody was paying attention. Resembling or simulating real life is what? Was it reasonable, realistic, generally speaking, or none of the above? Give you a couple of more seconds to think about that. And again, resembling or simulating real life is B, bravo, realistic, right? Is that a realistic price, real life? That should be a good indicator for you right there. Let's get into the content here. I've largely broken up the content today from a price perspective and from a cost perspective. And we're going to talk about reasonableness, realism, and analysis from both a price perspective today and from a cost perspective. So what is price reasonableness? This is, and I remind clients of this every day. I remind students in almost every webinar, certainly any time that this kind of topic comes up. The government or the prime, depending on what your relationship is, ultimately has, right? They have the responsibility to make that ultimate decision. Is this product or service being purchased at a fair and reasonable price, right? At the end of the day, that's ultimately what matters. The government wants to make sure they're not paying more for something, right? Is the price too high? Are they paying more for something than they should? It's also important to note here, and it's where I have to remind my clients of this, contractors, my clients, those of you on the call here, have a responsibility. This is not necessarily called out in the FAR, but contractors really do have a responsibility to help the government or the prime in making that determination of fair and reasonable pricing. That means you have to be, certainly they're the ones responsible for making the ultimate decision, right? And they're going to potentially get information from you through market research and some other ways that we'll talk about in a moment. But at the end of the day, you really have a responsibility to help them make that decision. And honestly, right, it's in your best interest to do that, right? Because the sooner that they can make that determination of a fair and reasonable price, then the sooner they can issue the award to you and you can proceed. So let's talk about price analysis for a moment. Price analysis is the process of examining and evaluating a proposal's price without, this is a key part here, right? Without evaluating its separate cost elements and proposed profit. So if you have a fixed price contract, as an example, and you've got otherwise have an exemption from submitting certified cost or pricing data. So let's say you have a commercial item exemption from submitting certified cost or pricing data. At the first level, the government or the prime should be making a determination of fair and reasonable price, and they should be doing so without evaluating any of those cost elements or the proposed profit. So sometimes what we've seen along the way, and I bet some of you have seen the same thing, is that the government or the prime will say, yeah, we're going to issue a fixed price contract, but you need to tell me how much profit you proposed in there. And we're doing our price analysis. Nope, not appropriate. It's not the correct answer, not the correct approach. This is one of those times where you need to understand what the FAR is, what the requirements are, the type of analysis that's required for the contractor for the situation, and be able to push back in a respectful manner and say, no, you are performing price analysis, you're not performing cost analysis. And again, we'll talk about some of the comparisons as we go through today's presentation. But if they're truly performing price analysis, they don't get to see the individual cost elements and they don't get to see the separate profit. Now, let me pause here and say that does not mean that you only provide the top level dollar. That's not what I said. I said that they're only evaluating the price aspect of this. So let's say that the contract that you're putting together has multiple CLINs, multiple labor categories, multiple items, maybe that they're purchasing from you, any combination of the above. Maybe it's being put together in phases or something. So you might have to break down that price into individual prices, right? But that's not necessarily individual cost elements, right? So for example, again, if the government is buying multiple labor categories from you, they're probably going to ask and expect to see the top level price by labor category, right? What is your price for a senior engineer versus a systems engineer versus an RF engineer versus, whatever. So you'll provide prices at those levels, right? And the number of hours that you're proposing, you'll extend that out, you'll total it up. So there's a big total at the bottom, right? For what the total contract or your total proposal is, but you'll have individual line item prices along the way. That's okay. Those are not cost elements. And again, we shouldn't be separately providing the proposed profit that we include in building up our price. Price analysis shall be used, again, I kind of said this already, when certified cost or pricing data are not required. And here, auditors and cost analysts, and I say cost analysts because that's what they, even though we're doing price analysis, we refer to them as cost analysts on the government or on the prime side, right? And you've probably heard that term, right? That your contracting officer or the contracts manager says, hey, we're going to send this over to the cost analyst for their analysis. They may be cost analysts, but they're still only supposed to be looking at price in this situation, okay? Again, that's the key thing to take home from this. There are 7 techniques for performing price analysis. We're not going to do a deep dive on these. We could certainly probably do an entire presentation just on this portion, but I do feel it's important that we talk about some of the key items here. So the 7 techniques, the first is adequate competition in response to a solicitation, right? That's our, in the in real life, we would like to have adequate competition, which is two or more responsible bidders, and it's important to note that they are responsible bidders, right? So you could have somebody who submits a price, but if they're otherwise not a responsible bidder, there may be you may be the only responsible bidder, right? And so now all of a sudden they don't have adequate competition. So even though they had a price, if the other party is determined to not be responsible, then we can't really include them in competition. But the best solution is that we've got adequate competition. That means two or more responsible bidders. And so then I know I've got to, if I choose one of these prices, then it's a fair and reasonable price because there was adequate competition in the marketplace for it. The second technique is comparison to historical prices paid. So I can go back and look to see, okay, maybe you were the only one who responded this time. When we put out this RFP, I've got your price, I don't have competition, but we've purchased this either from you or from somebody else. So maybe we bought it from your competitor in the past, maybe we bought it from you in the past, but I can go back and I have some historical information to say, okay, this price now, I can compare it, it's in line. Obviously, there's some factors that go into play when we certainly look at historical prices. Typically, the government likes to see those within about 12 months. We've certainly made the argument to be able to extend that to 18 to 24 months in certain situations where those items may not be purchased, every month or every quarter, as an example, right? So certainly, if you have an item that is being purchased on a regular basis, 12 months is usually the extent that they want to be able to look at for doing comparisons. If you have sometimes again some very large dollar items, something that's purchased in very low volume, maybe we only buy it every 18 months. Maybe we buy a bunch of it, right? And we know that it's going to last us 18 to 24 months or something. In those cases, I think an argument can, and again, we've been successful with that. The other thing, again, to keep in mind with historical prices is you also have to look at quantities and other factors anytime, really, right, when we're comparing previous prices that were paid. And I've got a couple of examples of some of these things as we go through here today. A perfect example of this in my past is that we would sell high volume for us and for the product, but not necessarily, huge numbers. So high volume for us might be 50 to 75 of an item for one of my previous employers. And so the government would come along, they would, let's say they buy 60 of an item. We deliver those over a 2 or 3 year period. And then they come back, a year later, 6 months later, whatever, and they say, okay, now we've decided we want to buy some spares, right? We want to put something on the shelf in case we have some failures or something that happens, right? So when they bought the original 60, they got quantity 60 pricing. And now they come to us, and again, it could be 6 months later, we've seen it, maybe 2 or 3 years later, and they say, okay, now we want to buy 2 and put them on the shelf. And so they start doing comparison, and they're going, well, wait a minute, these prices don't make any sense. And we say, well, first of all, you have to look at the fact that the last time you bought the item was 3 years ago. So there are, obviously for our purposes, for material, for labor, there's some other things that go into, obviously into our cost, right, that are going to drive that price up over a 3 year period. The other is that you bought 60 before, so you got quantity 60 pricing, and you're buying 2 now, so there is no quantity price break at 2, right? Seems pretty clear and straightforward. Be sure that, again, this is one of those areas where you may have to help the government or help your prime with this analysis, right? They may come back to you and say, well, hey, we bought this from you before. Why is this price so different than what it was before? Be able to support that price. Number 3 is parametric estimating data. So this is something like dollars per pound, dollars per linear foot, some things like that, where and these can also be things like one of the ideas that comes to mind for me is a fungible item, so something that spoils, like food, fruit. So for example, the government may, and we know they do, right? They buy lots of fresh produce for military bases and other situations, right? So if they are, if they're doing that, right, we can look at some comparisons in dollars per pound, dollars per some other unit. we've taken this and actually used it in a technical environment, and it worked out really well for us. And I'm always kind of proud of how this came together. We sold a modular electronic unit, high-end electronic unit for the government. And it was modular because the unit would perform different things. I mean, it had one general use, but it would perform different things or aspects within that use depending on the modules, and and certainly tweaking some speeds and bandwidth and some other things like that of what it could do. So the government would come and say, hey, we've got we want to put this on this aircraft, but it needs to be smaller or needs to be lighter or needs to operate in a different frequency range, or some different factors, right, that would come into play. And then they would come back and they would say, okay, well, we bought this other unit from you for another platform, and it was, and I'm just making up numbers because I don't remember. They would say, this other unit was $80,000, and now you're charging us $95,000 for this unit, and we don't understand what the difference in the price is. So we would go through on a module by module basis and say, okay, the $80,000 unit, that was, for example, maybe a 5-module unit that you bought from us. The $95,000 unit is a 6-module unit. That 6th module gives you the ability to perform this other function. And when we compare the first 5, you'll see that the tuning speed or the bandwidth, or again, some other factors, some technical factors, we would say, were changed based upon the requirements that you had. And so we would put some words to it, and then we would put some percentages and say, well, this one tunes, 10% faster, or the bandwidth here is 5% larger, or some other factors in there. And then we would come to the bottom and we would say, based upon the technical comparison, this other box is, approximately 8% or 12% or whatever more advanced or different in technology than this other one. And we would say, so you can see, for example, then, and it wasn't always an exact percentage. We weren't trying to drive it, down to the penny, but we'd be able to say, this box has 12% more, technical capabilities than the other, but the price is 15% higher, as an example. And so it was easier then for the government to say, okay, that kind of makes sense, right? That's a little more in line now with what these differences are. Number 4 is a competitive published price list. This is difficult, right? Because so many people don't publish price lists anymore. Or even if they do have price lists, right, there are various, they may have a list price, but then there are all the discounts and other things to come into play. But again, quite frankly, so many vendors, certainly in the government contracting space, simply don't have published price lists. So what can you do? Well, my advice to you as a contractor is to have an internally published price list. And what I mean by this is to have a price list that really is established. It needs to be a thorough price list where you have all your base pricing, you list the terms and conditions around this pricing, the schedule, the delivery kind of items. Are there any quantity discounts? Are there, additional warranties or other, whatever is part of the pricing needs to be listed in your price list. And then what I tell people is make a PDF of it and put a digital signature on it. So if you use a digital certificate and put a digital signature on it, it will time and date stamp that file so that, somebody could look at it and say, we know this file was created on this day. And the reason I say that, because what I've seen in the past is that companies will have a price list, but they'll have it in Word, they'll have it in a Microsoft Word document. Well, that's not locked down. There's no time and date stamp on it. There's a lot of edits and things that could have happened, and I don't know, so if you provide a copy of this file to me, right, if I'm the one on the outside trying to evaluate this and you say, we don't have a publicly published price list, but we do have a price list that we work from. If you send me a Word document, well, how do I know when that Word document was created, right? Did you update it last night and mock it up to match the price that you wanted to propose to me? But if you actually have like a PDF, again, that has a time and date stamp on it, a digital signature, and I can see, for example, that you created that, you created your 2021 pricing in, November of 2020, and it's got that date on it, and you're quoting me this price now, and I say, well, give me some evidence, and you can show me that PDF that has the time and date stamp on it, then at least I have a level of comfort. I'm not saying this is the perfect solution, right? But it does give me then a level of comfort to say, okay, I feel like that they didn't go out and try to just mock up some Word document last night and send it to me and call it their published price list. So keep that in mind. Again, some of the key factors to be in there, obviously not only the base price, but again, warranties, quantity discounts. For example, what are the terms of those quantity discounts? Do all the units have to be purchased at the same time? Do they have to be purchased within a certain period of time? We typically had a requirement that we would say we would honor quantity discount pricing as long as all orders are placed within 30 days. And that was critical for us because we would sometimes have multiple agencies in the government wanting to buy the same thing. But because there are multiple agencies, right, they would want to send multiple contracts. And we would say, okay, if you guys can all get together and get your orders to us within 30 days, we'll combine all of those orders and treat you as the government as having that one total quantity, and we'll give the total quantity price break across the board, even though it's multiple contracts. And that's okay as long as that's written in your policy and you treat everybody the same way every time you do that. The flip side might be true. You might say, no, we have to have all orders at the same time, or maybe you say we'll consider all orders within the year. One of the other factors that we would take into play is then what price applies. Let's say I'm buying multiple quantities, but I'm having these delivered over a 2 or 3 year period. Not an uncommon thing for the government, especially in the world of defense and what we used to do. Right, the government is building out platforms where they're not going to build all those airplanes at once. Right, they're building those airplanes over a 3, 4, or 5 year period. They would come and so they'd come to us and we'd say, okay, you're going to buy 60 units. We will honor the 60 unit pricing since you're going to place the order with us all at once. We'll deliver them over 3 years at the delivery dates you want. However, the unit price will go up for the year of delivery. So what we would do is we'd have all of our price lists. We'd have future pricing in there as well. And we'd say, okay, we'd come down to quantity 60 pricing and we'd say in 2021, quantity 60 pricing for the units that are delivered in 2021, you get, quantity 60 pricing. For the units that are delivered in 2022, you get the quantity 60 pricing, but the price is different because they're being delivered in 2022 and not in 2021. Those are some little nuances that you want to make sure you've got clearly defined in that price list. Number 5 is comparison to an independent government cost estimate. And I have to be honest, it's a little hard for me not to chuckle a little bit, at least on the inside with this one. I'm sure many of you have had the experience that I and many others have had in the government contracting world. Some of those independent government cost estimates seem to be wildly out of place, right? I mean, they're just significantly different numbers that come back, right? So and I've been there, I've seen them. I've worked on behalf of the government in the past, helping do some price analysis, and I would get the proposal from the vendor, from the contractor, and I'd get the independent government cost estimate. And sometimes they would just be worlds apart, and trying to reconcile that was very, very difficult. I don't have a magical answer for you on that, but just know that obviously that is one of the techniques that the government can use. Market research, right? So me going out, we've looked at all these other options of competition and other things. Notice that market research is down at the bottom from a price analysis perspective. The government and the prime are still supposed to do market research in general, right, as part of a solicitation. But from a price analysis perspective, it's next to last. And then the last item on here is data other than certified cost or pricing data. So that means, and again, notice that this is the last one on the list when we're talking about price analysis. So if it's a situation where the government is supposed to be performing price analysis or the prime, they're supposed to go